Welcome to Forensic Perspectives, the legal community's online resource for the latest in forensic accounting, business valuation, and financial litigation support. Your host for this podcast is Mark Gottlieb. In addition to being a certified public accountant, Mark has also obtained many professional accreditations in forensic accounting and business valuation. As one of the Tri-State's leading financial experts, Mark is also a frequent lecturer and writer. Without any further ado, please welcome the host of Forensic Perspectives, Mark Gottlieb.
Thank you and welcome to today's program. My guest today is attorney Eric Broder. Mr. Broder is a partner with Broder & Orland in Westport, Connecticut. He represents clients in complex matrimonial litigation that commonly include representing high net worth individuals and the preparation of premarital agreements, custody, visitation issues, and also attending to relocation and post-judgment matters. Eric is currently the treasurer of the Fairfield County Bar Association, the co-chair of its family law section, and as a member of the nominating committee and serves on its board of editors. In addition, he also serves as a special master in the family division of the Stamford and Bridgeport Superior Courts. In the 2009 and 2010 edition of Super Lawyers, he was selected as one of New England's rising stars in family law. Eric, welcome, and thank you for appearing on Forensic Perspectives.
Thank you for having me.
Eric, when you are first retained as counsel for someone who's interested in getting divorced, do you have a plan on how you're going to attend to the discovery process of the information that's required?
Certainly. In any divorce case, discovery can often be the most time-consuming and expensive portion of the case. And naturally, when someone wants to get a divorce, you think they're going to want to have the divorce end sooner than later. And discovery can slow down that process more than anything else in a case. So when a client first comes to see me at initial consultation, one of the documents I give them is basically a list of all the things that I know the other attorney is going to ask them for, whether it's bank accounts and brokerage account statements, credit card statements, anything that I know that I would ask if I represented that person's spouse. If it's a person who has their own business, I know the different documents and information I'm going to want to receive. So at the first initial consult, I'm going to say, this is what's ahead of you. If you want to make this case move faster, start gathering the information.
It's interesting you say that because I remember at one point in time sitting in a conference with a couple of attorneys and a judge, and we're trying to resolve a matrimonial action. And the judge said to the parties sitting in front of him, I rarely see people at their best and often see people at their worst. And it occurs to me when the judge said that this is really probably one of the most stressful times that these people are going through. And so the divorce process, which obviously is uncertain to some who have only gotten divorced once or only getting divorced once or married once. But you as an experienced attorney, you have seen this a number of times before. In fact, you could probably say you've been divorced many, many times before. But what is the approach that you take to get your client on board with collecting all these documents? There are financial documents, there are operational documents, there are personal, there are business. Do you have a checklist or do you have an approach that you have your clients go through?
Well, I do, and it often depends on who the client is. And I say that because you have to almost tailor your approach to different types of clients. If you have, and I'm going to be a little bit maybe inappropriate here when I say a typical Fairfield County housewife, and when I say that, I mean someone who doesn't really handle any of the financial matters, doesn't write a check. They have a credit card maybe. It may even be in the husband's name. They might have access to very little. But to that end, there may be a joint bank account. There may be an account in their own name. I will tell that person, go to the bank, go to Citibank, go to People's Bank. Tell them you need these documents from your account. They have to give it to you. If there's a brokerage account at a Merrill Lynch, for example, in joint name, I'm going to tell them to contact their financial broker at Merrill Lynch. Get the information from them directly. That involves a little more hand-holding. As the client gets more sophisticated, then I'm going to sit down and tell them, A, do you keep good records at home? And if you do, bring those documents to me. If you keep your monthly statements, bring them to me. If you don't, let's call, or you call whoever it is at your bank and have them get that information to me. Now, sometimes they'll ask me to call, which I'll gladly do, or my office will gladly do, but mind you, that's a more expensive way of gathering the information. The other alternative is if they don't have the information, we can have them fill out an authorization, maybe for an old credit card they closed a year ago that they don't have, and we'll submit it to whether it's Amex or Visa, and they'll send the information directly to us. Because if it's within your custody or control, you have an obligation to provide those documents.
That being said, it appears to me that there are a couple of objectives to this accumulation of information or the discovery process. The first one would obviously be to identify the assets and the liabilities of the marital couple. That may include not only cash and brokerage statements that you had mentioned, but also real estate and ownership in businesses. But then also these documents that you've just identified and listed, they also can be used to identify a certain lifestyle. Now, whether your client is of modest or extreme financial capacity or means, do you go through the same process of identifying their lifestyle so that you know how they lived and what they require to continue that living? And in addition to that, I'll give you a complex question. When you represent the non-money spouse, whether it be the husband or the wife, the one that's not working, the one that doesn't earn as much, the one that may have more responsibilities in the home as opposed to the workforce, what is your tone and attitude in regards to assisting them maintain a lifestyle they've grown to be accustomed to?
Well, a lot of that depends on how much the spouse earns. And when I say that, there's sort of a misnomer, and maybe it's a little too much LA law that people see, that a spouse is entitled to maintain or continue to live the lifestyle that they're accustomed to living. Well, if you have somebody who earns $300,000 a year, for argument's sake, and they don't save any money because they spend it all and they have some credit card debt, you've got to remember that's being done under one roof. One phone bill, one cable bill, one heating bill, one mortgage. At the time of the divorce, that becomes two. Now, there's going to be a rent possibly. There'll be another cable bill. There'll be another guy to pay to do the snow plowing. So maintaining the current lifestyle isn't always possible in certain cases. One thing we do, though, is we sit down and we try to determine what the money's being spent on. Now, some people know already and can tell you, my husband or wife makes X amount of dollars a year, and I know that we've saved very little. And the job is almost done because they're a little more financially savvy. We often get a complaint that says, my spouse has an overseas account. It's happened before, but when I say how much is in the overseas account, or what do they think? They tell me there are millions of dollars. And then I work backwards. We look to see what their expenses have been, and we talk about them, what their mortgage is, what their taxes are. And then at the end of the day, after we get to a monthly number, and for argument's sake, if the monthly number is $20,000 that we get to when we deal with food, clothing, children's camp, we now identify that this couple spends $240,000 a year. Well, that'll often happen, and then we'll look at the tax returns and realize the husband only makes $350,000 a year. So obviously, there can't be money hidden offshore from the husband's income in that particular example.
Do you find there to be a difference in your approach and in your ability to negotiate a settlement or even proceed through a trial when people's lifestyle is financed through current year income as opposed to savings or even as opposed to other sources of income? Sometimes people have inheritance or they have a trust fund. So there could be more than one and often multiple sources of income or cash flow that's used to support the lifestyle.
We see that often, and what really creates a problem is how people manage their lives after divorce. Because there may be a trust that throws off a certain amount of income, and you also have the problem of someone's erratic income. You have someone on Wall Street whose base salary might be $150,000, and then they get big bonuses of $1 million or $2 million, and it varies year to year. And what happens, like it happened recently this year, where people didn't get those bonuses, yet they owed a lot of money that they anticipated paying back from their bonuses. So you've got to consider all the sources of income, and you almost have to help your client financially plan for the future. When the case ends in our office, you still have an obligation to make sure that client gets back on their feet.
All right, let's take a step back in our conversation and talk about the initial discovery process. You mentioned that you ask your client to bring bank statements and brokerage statements and identify assets and liabilities that he or she may have. Often, you may be on the side of the fence that does not have access to these records. And so you have to employ certain, finesse to obtain these records. Do you find that your adversary is cooperative in this effort?
It really depends on the adversary. And when people ask me how long a case will take and how much it will cost, I ask who's on the other side. And I hate to be so direct that way, but certain people take certain approaches. And sometimes it's the client that directs the attorney to act in a certain manner. There are certain documents and information that they have to turn over. In a business, as you know, Mark, a P&L statement, business tax returns, a general ledger, we're entitled to see all those documents. The more difficulty we have getting those documents voluntarily from the other side, we then have to go to court and file motions, and we basically have to spend money to try to get information that we know most likely will be entitled to.
Do you find that the court is sympathetic to the non-money spouse when they're searching for these missing documents to help support their case?
I do. I find the court in Connecticut has a pretty liberal, open way of handling discovery. I've seen it with electronic discovery too, in recent cases where emails have been made completely discoverable, more so than I would have anticipated. And the court does sort of protect the free flow of information. There are a couple of cases where people have been punished for failure to comply with that discovery. I'd like to say, and I think a lot of members of the bar here would agree, that there's not enough of a deterrence from the court, and we hope that there is more. There have been cases where people have been basically charged by the court with paying the other side's attorney's fees, and also have been told by the court, for every day that you don't provide this documents, you're going to pay sanctions of $1,000 a day. You seem to get the documents pretty quickly then.